Have you ever experienced a moment when everything seemed completely ordinary, only for it to spiral out of control in the blink of an eye? Stay with me, because what happened here was more than just a routine traffic stop. It became a turning point that no one saw coming. But first, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button because you'll want to stick around for what's coming next. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. It was another hot, sweltering afternoon in Jackson, Mississippi, as Officer John Matthews sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, half watching the road, half lost in thought about his plans for the weekend. The sun hung high, casting its scorching heat down on the cracked asphalt, the air thick with humidity as it rippled above the pavement. His convenience store coffee was lukewarm, and his mind wandered to the mundane tasks of the shift, unaware that today was anything but ordinary. He thought about the games he might catch later, maybe a cold beer and a much-needed break from the grind. Little did he know, fate had a different plan in store for him. As Matthews cruised down Woodrow Wilson Avenue, everything seemed as predictable as any other day. That is until his sharp eyes caught a black 2014 Cadillac CTS rolling through a yellow light that, in his opinion, looked a little too close to red. His fingers almost instinctively flicked the switch, turning on his sirens. The sudden sharp whoop of the police siren cut through the thick air like a warning bell, and the Cadillac smoothly pulled over, obeying without hesitation. What happened next, however, was anything but normal. The driver of the vehicle, a man in his early 60s with a clean-shaven face and sharp eyes, did not flinch. No swerve at the last second. No panicked glance in the rearview mirror. Nothing. This wasn't the usual response Matthews was accustomed to. His hand tightened around the gear shift as he prepared to step out, the familiar weight of authority settling over him like a second skin. But as he approached the car, something in the air shifted. This wasn't just another stop. The man behind the wheel, Colonel James Lawson, a former military officer, greeted Matthews with a calm, unwavering gaze that made Matthews' grip on his belt tighten ever so slightly. He wasn't sure why, but this man, this older black man, didn't feel like the usual suspects he dealt with. There was no fear, no anxiety, just a steady confidence that Matthews found unsettling. As Matthews asked for the driver's license and registration, Lawson met his eyes with a steady, composed gaze. He wasn't rattled, he wasn't defensive, he was just there, and that, more than anything else, sent a shiver down Matthews' spine. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Officer Lawson's voice was calm and precise, not confrontational but firm. Matthews immediately bristled at the question. He hated it when people dared to question his authority, but instead of simply obeying, Lawson was composed, almost too composed. Matthews snapped his patience already thinning. "You ran a red light," he responded with authority, his voice carrying that familiar edge. But Lawson, unfazed, merely glanced at the intersection in his rearview mirror before returning his attention to Matthews. "That light was yellow when I crossed it." Lawson said, his tone quiet. Sure, and without a hint of doubt, Matthews felt the blood rush to his face. He didn't have a dash cam to prove his version of events, but that didn't matter to him. His word was law on the streets. Still, there was something about Lawson's demeanor that made Matthews uneasy. "License and registration." Matthews repeated his tone, becoming more insistent, his patience running thin. Lawson raised an eyebrow as if assessing Matthews' words. With a slow and deliberate motion, he reached into the glove compartment and handed over the requested documents without any fumbling, as if it was all routine. It was all too perfect, too controlled. Matthews scanned the name on the license, Colonel James Lawson. It didn't ring a bell, but there was something about the way Lawson handed over the documents. No nervous movements, no hint of hesitation that unsettled Matthews even further. This wasn't just some random civilian. This was someone who knew how to handle himself in the presence of authority, and that made Matthews uncomfortable. The feeling gnawed at him as he ordered Lawson to step out of the car. Lawson hesitated just for a second. He didn't argue, didn't resist. He simply asked, "Why?" A single question, calm but piercing. "Because I said so," Matthews barked his patience. Now wearing dangerously thin. There was a pause, a brief, heavy silence, but it was enough to make Matthews feel the shift. Lawson's eyes locked onto his, and then, slowly, he sighed. Not in fear, but in quiet resignation. "All right," Lawson said, his voice a deep, measured calm as he opened the door and stepped out. Matthews watched as Lawson unfolded himself from the car with the smooth, calculated precision that spoke of experience of someone who had done this before. He didn't fumble with his seatbelt or hesitate at the door. No. Lawson moved with purpose, and that only made Matthews more agitated. This wasn't just another stop. It wasn't just another routine traffic violation. This man wasn't scared, and that bothered Matthews more than anything else. He gestured for Lawson to move to the back of the car, hands on the trunk. Lawson complied, his movements deliberate, but as Matthews began to pat him down, he heard something, a quiet mutter barely audible. "This is unnecessary," Lawson said, his voice steady but tinged with quiet disbelief. Matthews clenched his jaw, his temper flaring. "Excuse me," he snapped, his irritation growing. "You have my ID. You've run my plates. You know I'm clean," Lawson said without raising his voice, his calm tone only further rubbing Matthews the wrong way. There was no resistance, no attempt to challenge him outright, yet the words hung in the air like a challenge. Matthews didn't respond. He finished the search and stepped back, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his cuffs. Without warning, he reached for them. The air changed instantly. Matthews' fingers tightened around the cuffs, his mind made up. Lawson wasn't going to get away with this. "Turn around," Matthews ordered, his voice sharp, but Lawson didn't move. And that's when Matthews made the biggest mistake of his career. In the next few moments, everything Matthews thought he knew about power, authority, and control would be tested, because Colonel James Lawson, despite his age, wasn't going down without a fight. And Matthews, well, he wasn't prepared for what was coming next. Stay tuned, because what happens next is something Matthews and the rest of the world wasn't ready for. This story isn't just about one man's encounter with the law. It's about a system that's been broken for far too long. Remember to hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. This story is just getting started, and you don't want to miss how it all unfolds. The silence between them stretched thick and uncomfortable as Officer Matthews waited for Colonel Lawson to respond. Matthews had expected resistance, anger, maybe even fear. But instead, he was met with nothing but calm. Lawson's steady gaze held Matthews in place as if daring him to take the next step. In the moments that followed, the tension in the air grew palpable. The power dynamics had shifted, and Matthews could feel it. The unspoken challenge was clear. Lawson wasn't just going to comply with authority without question, and that made Matthews uncomfortable. Uncomfortable enough to escalate things. "Why aren't you just cooperating?" Matthews barked, his voice tinged with frustration. His grip on the cuffs tightened, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. Lawson didn't answer right away. He simply exhaled slowly as though to calm himself before speaking. "Officer," he began, his voice measured and controlled. "You don't need to do this. I've done nothing wrong." His words hung in the air, each one more significant than the last. Matthews' pulse quickened and he could feel his anger rising again. The calmness of Lawson, the lack of fear, was like a mirror reflecting Matthews' own insecurities. He was the one who was supposed to be in control, wasn't he? But here was this man standing tall, his eyes unwavering, and Matthews found himself questioning his own authority. He hated that feeling. This wasn't just any traffic stop. This was something far bigger. It wasn't about running a red light. It wasn't even about the law. It was about power control. And who got to decide when they were above the system? "I said turn around," Matthews ordered again, this time with more force. His jaw was clenched and his hand moved to grab Lawson's arm, but Lawson didn't flinch. Instead, he simply stood still, as if waiting for Matthews to make the next move. And then, in a voice so calm it almost felt like a whisper, he spoke again. "Officer, I strongly suggest you reconsider what you're about to do." The words landed like a punch to Matthews' chest. He'd heard people challenge authority before, but never like this. never with such grace. And now, for the first time in his career, Matthews began to doubt himself. What if Lawson was right? What if this wasn't just about him being an officer doing his job, but about something much deeper, something that Matthews hadn't even begun to understand? The thought lingered in Matthews' mind for a moment, but then his anger flared again. He was the officer after all. He was in control. He couldn't back down now. Without another word, Matthews lunged forward, grabbing Lawson's arm and attempting to twist him around. But that's when it happened. In a move that Matthews never saw coming, Lawson turned faster than Matthews could react. His wrist snapped free with an effortless motion, and Matthews found himself standing there, his hand empty as Lawson faced him with that same unshaken gaze. Matthews froze for a split second, his heart hammering in his chest. Lawson wasn't resisting, but he was clearly in control of the situation now. Matthews' grip tightened around the cuffs, his frustration boiling over. He wasn't about to let this man, this black man, this former military officer who had seen more of the world than Matthews ever would make him feel inferior. No, he wouldn't be made a fool of, I said. Turn around, Matthews shouted, his voice cracking with the force of his command. But instead of responding with anger or defiance, Lawson simply sighed, shaking his head as though Matthews were a child throwing a tantrum. Matthews' fist clenched around the metal cuffs, the pressure building inside him. He was supposed to be the one who held all the cards. He had the badge, the power, the right to act. Yet here he was, being outmatched by a man who in Matthews' mind should have been scared, who should have been intimidated by the authority Matthews held over him. But Lawson wasn't scared. In fact, he seemed almost bored by the whole thing. You think you can just put me in cuffs because you don't like the way I answered a question? Lawson asked, his voice still calm but now tinged with disappointment. This is a mistake, officer. A huge mistake. The words were simple, yet they cut through the tension like a knife. Matthews' hands shook. He wanted to snap at Lawson to prove that he wasn't afraid, but there was something in Lawson's eyes that stopped him. Something that made Matthews feel small, insignificant. Matthews clenched his jaw, furious at how Lawson was challenging his authority. He needed to regain control, but he didn't know how. Turn around, Matthews demanded again, his voice low and threatening. This time he reached for Lawson's arm, determined to force him into submission. But before Matthews could act, Lawson took a step back and looked him squarely in the eyes. Are you really going to do this? Lawson's voice was calm, steady, almost soothing. But it carried the weight of a man who had lived through more than his fair share of injustice, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and still managed to hold on to his dignity. Lawson wasn't just questioning Matthews' authority, he was questioning the system that Matthews upheld. For a moment, Matthews hesitated. His mind raced. He wasn't just dealing with a simple traffic stop anymore. He was dealing with something much bigger, something far more dangerous than the red light violation Matthews had believed this whole encounter to be: racism, power, control. Lawson's words hung in the air, a reminder of the structures that existed beyond Matthews' small-town patrol. His chest tightened. What was he really doing here? Was he doing his job, or was he using his badge to uphold something much darker? Something that had been festering in the system for years, hidden just beneath the surface. Before Matthews could answer his own questions, he heard Lawson speak again, his tone unwavering. This isn't just about me, officer. This is about every black woman, every black man who's ever been unfairly stopped, harassed, or mistreated because of their skin color. This is about the system that lets men like you get away with it. The words hit Matthews like a slap in the face, and for the first time the full weight of the situation settled in his chest. The realization that he wasn't just fighting with Lawson, he was fighting against something far more dangerous than one man's ego. Matthews had made a mistake that would have repercussions far beyond this moment, far beyond his career. But for Colonel Lawson, this was more than just one man's misstep. It was part of a long, painful history of racial injustice that had been quietly accepted for far too long. As Matthews reached for the cuffs again, something inside him snapped. This wasn't just about authority. This wasn't just about power. This was about accountability. And it was too late for him to stop what was about to unfold. Stay tuned because this story isn't over yet. It's about to take a turn that no one saw coming. The consequences are just beginning. Matthews's grip tightened around the cuffs as his patience wore thin. The small voice in the back of his mind, the one that had been quietly whispering doubts, was drowned out by the surge of anger coursing through his veins. He wasn't just angry with Colonel Lawson, though. No, he was angry at himself. Angry that he'd let this situation spiral out of control. Angry that the calm, composed black man standing before him had managed to expose Matthew's own insecurities, his blind reliance on the authority that came with his badge. With a final, tight-lipped breath, Matthews reached forward, grabbing Lawson's arm once more, his fingers digging into the older man's skin. "I said, turn around." His voice cracked under the pressure, but there was no turning back now. In his mind, he was justified. This was his job. He was an officer of the law, and that meant he had to maintain control no matter the cost. But at what cost? Lawson didn't budge. He didn't flinch, didn't resist. He simply looked at Matthews, those eyes sharp and unblinking, cutting through Matthews' facade like a hot knife through butter. There was no fear in those eyes. Only understanding. Officer Lawson said, his voice low, calm, and steady. "This is your last chance to let me go. I don't want this to escalate." Matthews's chest tightened. For a moment he almost wanted to stop. He almost wanted to let Lawson go. But then the pride that had driven him so far took over. He couldn't back down. He had to show the man who was in charge. He had to prove he wasn't weak. And in that moment, everything started to unravel. In one fluid motion, Lawson's body shifted. It was like watching a trained fighter in the ring. Quick, controlled, and deliberate, Matthews was too slow to react. Before he could even process what had happened, Lawson had spun around his wrist, slipping free from Matthews' grasp like it was nothing. The movement was so fluid, so precise that Matthews didn't know what hit him. Matthews staggered back, his heart racing, his mind a whirlwind. This man, this older black man, was outclassing him at every turn. But Matthews wouldn't give up. No, he couldn't. He wasn't about to let a suspect, someone who was in his mind already challenging his authority, walk away without facing the consequences. He couldn't allow himself to look weak, especially not in front of someone like Colonel Lawson. The pressure to prove himself felt unbearable. He was the officer. He was the one with the badge and the gun. He couldn't let this man make him look foolish. "Turn around now," Matthews growled, his voice low and full of fury. But Lawson didn't respond with anger. No, he simply shook his head. His expression didn't change. Not even a flicker of emotion passed over his face. There was no fear, no defiance, only calm resignation. The kind of calm that can only come from years of experience of having lived through things most people would never understand. "I don't need to turn around." Lawson said, his voice as steady as ever. "You're in the wrong here, officer. You're not just violating my rights. You're continuing a pattern of injustice, and you know it." The words struck Matthews like a slap across the face. Pattern of injustice. The words echoed in his mind. He tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the task at hand, but they wouldn't go away. Was Lawson right? Was he just another officer who had let his power go unchecked? Was he part of the problem? "You're being unreasonable." Matthews snapped, his voice tinged with desperation. Lawson finally spoke again. His words not as a challenge but as a plea for clarity, for reason. "You're right, officer. This isn't about me anymore. It's about something far bigger than just one black man. One black woman who's been harassed by the system, time and time again. You know what I'm talking about." The shift in Lawson's tone made Matthews pause. The power had shifted. Matthews suddenly felt like he was the one being interrogated, the one on trial. His hands clenched around the cuffs again, and for the first time the weight of the situation fully hit him. Lawson wasn't just any citizen. He was Colonel James Lawson, a man who had lived through systemic injustice, a man who had been to war, who had fought for this country. Yet here he was treated like any other suspect by a man who until that very moment had believed that he had the law on his side. Matthew's throat tightened, and for a moment he found himself at a crossroads. He could let it go, could let this man go without pressing charges, could walk away from the situation and chalk it up to an honest mistake, or he could double down and prove that he was in charge. The badge was supposed to protect him, but at that moment, Matthews felt anything but protected. The siren's wail from another officer's patrol car in the distance, a harsh reminder of the chaos Matthews had already unleashed. The tension was rising, and with it came the realization that what Matthews had believed to be a small incident, just a simple traffic stop, was quickly becoming something much bigger, something much darker. Suddenly, Matthews' radio crackled. It was dispatch, but the words were muffled by the overwhelming rush of panic flooding his system. He tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. "Dispatch. This is Officer Matthews," he started, but the radio cut off. It was at that moment that Matthews knew this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. He wasn't dealing with just any citizen. He was dealing with a man who had lived through history. A man who had seen injustice firsthand, and now was calling him out. But Matthews didn't know how to deal with it. His authority was slipping through his fingers, and the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. He had crossed a line, and now there was no way back. The silence between them felt like an eternity. Matthews knew he had made a mistake, but it wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything leading up to it, everything he had ever learned about power, about authority. Everything he thought he knew was now being questioned by Colonel Lawson's calm resolve. This wasn't just about a red light anymore. It was about justice. It was about power and accountability. It was about a system that had long let injustice slide under the radar, and Matthews was now a part of that system. But Lawson wasn't done. He looked at Matthews one last time as though to remind him of something he had known all along. "You can keep doing this, officer, but you'll have to face the consequences eventually. The truth always comes out, and no badge is going to protect you from that." And that was the hook, because Matthews had just learned what it meant to be on the wrong side of the law, and it was far more than just a traffic stop. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because you're going to want to follow how this story unfolds. The consequences of Matthews' actions are only beginning to surface, and believe me, it's going to get even more intense from here. What do you think will happen next? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next part of this incredible story. The events that followed that fateful traffic stop quickly spiraled into a nightmare that Matthews couldn't escape. Colonel James Lawson may have walked away from that confrontation unscathed. But Matthews, officer. John Matthews wasn't so lucky. The moment his badge was no longer a shield, the truth came crashing down. And as much as he tried to pretend it wasn't happening, the world around him began to unravel. The radio crackled in Matthews' patrol car once again, but this time it wasn't dispatch. It was his sergeant, Sergeant Henry Grant, his voice laced with anger and disbelief. "Matthews!" Grant barked, his tone sharp enough to cut through the tension in Matthews' chest. "Get to my office now!" Matthews could feel his stomach drop as he made his way to the station, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound anchor. He had made a mistake, a monumental mistake, and the consequences were already rolling in faster than he could control. The truth that he had tried to avoid, the truth he had never wanted to face, was staring him in the face. Now, the system he was supposed to uphold wasn't just broken. It was corrupt. And Matthews, as much as he wanted to deny it, was a part of that system. The door to Sergeant Grant's office slammed open before Matthews even had a chance to knock. Grant was standing by his desk phone in hand, a look of fury in his eyes. Matthews stepped inside, his hands clammy, his mind racing with the words he had to say but didn't know how to speak. "Why the hell do I have a U.S. Army colonel sitting in our holding cell?" Grant's voice hit Matthews like a physical blow. Matthews stood frozen for a moment, but before he could say anything, Grant slapped a file down on his desk. The words on the page didn't even register at first, but the name, Colonel James Lawson, was all too clear. The realization hit Matthews with full force. He hadn't just arrested a random civilian. He had arrested a high-ranking officer, a man with decades of experience, a man whose life and reputation were untouchable and who had connections that Matthews couldn't even begin to comprehend. Grant's voice was cold and full of disdain as he continued. Colonel James Lawson, 30 years in the military, 2 tours overseas, Pentagon, security clearance, direct line to the Secretary of Defense. And you decided to throw him in a holding cell like some common criminal. Grant's eyes burned with frustration, and Matthews could feel the anger radiating off his superior. "I didn't know," Matthews muttered, but it sounded weak even to him. He didn't know, and now that lack of awareness was going to cost him more than just his pride. It was going to cost him his career. "Of course you didn't know," Grant sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You didn't think to check his ID. You didn't think to consider who you were dealing with. You're lucky this didn't escalate into a full-blown scandal." Matthews wanted to protest, wanted to defend his actions, but he couldn't. He had been so blinded by his own authority, so sure of his own power, that he had overlooked everything that mattered. He had seen a black man, an older man, and assumed wrongly that he was just another person to control. And now that assumption had set off a chain of events that Matthews couldn't stop. Grant stood up, pacing back and forth in frustration. "You've created a mess, Matthews. You've put this department under a microscope, and the public is already turning on us. The news outlets are having a field day with this." He pointed to the TV screen where the news story about Lawson's arrest was already flashing across the screen, accompanied by the words "police brutality" and "unlawful detainment." Matthews watched the screen in stunned silence. He saw Lawson's face calm, composed, not angry, but disappointed. Matthews had expected Lawson to be angry, to be vengeful. He had expected a confrontation, a heated argument, or even a struggle. But no, Lawson was, as always, a man of control, a man who was used to dealing with people like Matthews, used to seeing people like Matthews in positions of power. And yet, Lawson had maintained his dignity in a way that Matthews never could. The press wasn't the only thing Matthews had to worry about. The department was now facing a full internal review of Matthews' conduct. Grant dropped another bombshell. "We've already had 3 different military officials calling demanding to know why one of their own was treated this way. There are FBI agents here right now asking questions. This is only the beginning." Grant's words felt like a cold slap to Matthews' face. He had always believed he was untouchable. The badge he wore had shielded him from scrutiny. He had never questioned his authority until now. And then the hammer came down. Matthews had been in the force long enough to know that when internal affairs came knocking, it wasn't good. The department had launched a full-scale investigation into Matthews' actions. Every traffic stop he had made in the last year was now under the microscope. The questioning, the probing, the accusations. It was all coming for him, and there was nowhere to hide. Grant sat back down. His face set in a grim expression. "They're going to dig through everything, Matthews. All your stops, all your arrests. They're going to look for patterns, and if they find that you've been targeting black people, you're done. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about a history of abuse. It's about a pattern of racist behavior that you didn't even realize was there." The words hit Matthews like a ton of bricks. A pattern. He had always thought of himself as fair, as just he had never seen himself as part of the problem. But now, in the face of this reckoning, he couldn't deny the truth. He had been part of that pattern. Grant's voice softened slightly. "You need to make this right, Matthews. You need to stop running from the truth and face the consequences of what you've done. Because whether you like it or not, Colonel Lawson's case is the spark that's going to ignite a movement." Matthews didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. He had no allies in the department. The weight of what he had done was sinking in, and the guilt was suffocating him. But the worst part was that Matthews knew this wasn't just about him. This was about a black man and every black woman, every black person who had ever been wronged by the system that was supposed to protect them. Matthews knew that the fallout was just beginning, and the worst was yet to come. Don't go anywhere. This story isn't over yet. The price Matthews will have to pay is just starting to unfold, and it's about to get even more intense. Make sure you subscribe and leave a comment. How do you think this will end? What should happen to Matthews? And what does this say about the system that let this all happen? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. The truth is just beginning to unravel. The days following Matthews' encounter with Colonel Lawson felt like a blur of mounting pressure and inevitable consequences. Matthews had gone from feeling untouchable, wrapped in the supposed protection of his badge, to being the subject of scorn and public scrutiny. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had exposed the cracks in the system. Cracks that had been ignored for far too long. Colonel Lawson, with his quiet strength and unwavering dignity, had forced Matthews and the world to confront something that had been overlooked for decades, the deep-seated racism that festered within the police force. News of the incident had spread like wildfire. It wasn't just another story of police misconduct. It was the flashpoint for a larger movement that was quickly gaining traction. Social media exploded with calls for justice, for accountability, and for reform. Public figures, activists, and even military officials rallied behind Colonel Lawson, while Matthews became the face of everything wrong with the system. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Matthews sat alone in his apartment one evening, the hum of the TV filling the silence. He stared at the screen, watching as Colonel Lawson was interviewed by the media. The calm in Lawson's voice, the power in his words. It was a stark contrast to Matthews' anger, frustration, and guilt. Lawson was now a symbol for the fight against police brutality and racial injustice, and Matthews couldn't escape the overwhelming realization that he had been part of the problem. "This isn't about me," Lawson had said in one of his interviews, his words clear and measured. "This is about a system that has allowed racism to thrive. It's about a black man, a black woman, and every person of color who has been harassed, unjustly targeted, and treated as less than. It's time for change, and it starts with holding people like Officer Matthews accountable." Matthews felt his stomach tighten. For the first time in his life, he couldn't deny it. He had failed. He had been part of a corrupt system, one that valued authority over justice, one that had allowed him to make decisions based on bias and prejudice. He had arrested Colonel Lawson as though he were just another criminal, without questioning his own actions, without thinking about the broader implications. The department was no longer protecting him. Matthews had been placed on administrative leave, but that felt like a formality. The internal affairs investigation into his actions was only the beginning. It wasn't just about one stop. It was about the years of behavior that had led up to this moment. Matthews wasn't the only officer who had let their biases dictate their actions. But now, for the first time, the world was paying attention. Sergeant Henry Grant had called Matthews into his office that morning. There was no anger in Grant's voice now, only disappointment. "You've become a symbol of everything that's wrong with this department," Grant said, his tone heavy. "You didn't just mess up this one time, Matthews. You've allowed this to happen over and over." And now, everyone's watching. Matthews had no response. He wanted to say something to defend himself, but the truth was he couldn't. Colonel Lawson had exposed him. And it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been treated unfairly by the system he had sworn to protect. The public backlash was relentless. The department was being forced to reckon with its own failings, and Matthews had become the poster child for that reckoning. It wasn't just Matthews who was being held accountable. The public was demanding change. The call for police reform had never been louder, and Colonel Lawson's actions had made that demand impossible to ignore. The department began implementing new policies, including mandatory racial bias training for all officers. Oversight committees were created, and the investigation into Matthews was expanded to include an audit of every officer's actions, every stop, every arrest. The force was being torn apart and rebuilt, but not because of Matthews. It was because of Colonel Lawson and the strength he had shown in the face of injustice, Matthews had been fired. The official statement came down just days later, and Matthews's name was officially linked to the scandal. But it wasn't just his career that was over. It was his place in a system that had failed him too. Matthews had bought into the idea that the badge made him untouchable. He had thought that the power he wielded in his uniform would shield him from accountability. But now, all he had was the bitter taste of failure. Meanwhile, Colonel Lawson had become the hero of the story. His actions had sparked a movement, one that Matthews had never seen coming. Lawson wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't trying to take down Matthews or destroy his career. Lawson's mission was greater than that. It was about fighting for justice for the people who had been wrongfully treated by the system time and time again. Lawson's fight was for everyone who had ever been mistreated by the law. And for Matthews, that was the hardest pill to swallow. He wasn't the one who had taken a stand. He wasn't the one who had been bold enough to challenge the system. He had been just another cog in the machine, too blind to see the injustice he was perpetuating. As Matthews sat in his apartment staring at the phone that had been silent for days, he realized something Colonel Lawson had won. But this wasn't just Lawson's victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been wronged by the system. It was a victory for the black men, black women, and communities of color who had been fighting for justice for so long. Matthews had become a cautionary tale, but Lawson had become a beacon of hope. Colonel Lawson's message had made it clear the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and Matthews, despite his own failure, couldn't deny that change was coming. So what happens next? Matthews has been fired, his career destroyed. But the movement Lawson sparked is only gaining momentum. The public demand for change is louder than ever, and Matthews will have to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. Colonel Lawson, on the other hand, will continue his fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who has ever been treated unjustly by the system. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something much bigger. The fight for equality and accountability is far from over, and the lessons from this case will continue to echo throughout the country. What do you think? Is this the right outcome for Matthews, or do you think he deserves another chance? What about Colonel Lawson? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more updates on this ongoing fight for justice. The battle isn't over yet.